taking part in the Infrastructure Summit, part of the Singapore FinTech Festival, and you're on the Global Common Channel with me, Manisha Tank. Now, building more on the topic of artificial intelligence, which we touched upon earlier, we now turn to the question of regulation. Should the use of artificial intelligence in the financial services sector be regulated? If the answer is yes, then what is the best way to do this? Nick Lewins, a financial services lead at Microsoft, will be moderating the next panel conversation. Joining him will be Amy Shi-Nash, Global Head of Analytics and Data Science at HSBC, and Nicolas Chapados, who is co-founder of Element AI. Also, Dr. John Hull, Professor of Derivatives and Risk Management at the University of Toronto, and Dr. Marcin Detyniecki, who is Group Chief Data Scientist at AXA. Let's join Nick and the panel to hear opinions on the regulation of artificial intelligence in the financial services.
Oh, good morning, good day to you, good evening, and welcome to our panel today on the topic of should AI be regulated in the financial services industry. I'm really looking forward to a fantastic discussion with these global experts, and I hope that you are too. So let's get straight into the first question for our panel. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to respond to this. In reality, there's a spectrum of tools available to regulators. It's not just a binary choice of regulate or not. At the extreme ends of that spectrum of potential actions for regulators, making or updating laws at one end, or at the other end, self-regulation with no guidance. In the middle, of course, there are a number of regulatory approaches, such as creating binding requirements under existing laws, developing formal standards, issuing principles to be abided by, publishing of regulatory guidance on best practices when deploying AI, and conducting information and education campaigns. So with this background, my question for the panelists is, do you think AI in financial services needs regulatory action? And if so, which of these types of regulatory action do you think is most appropriate? So I'm going to ask Marcin first to lead us off.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you for having me at this prestigious festival and panel. Actually, I thank you very much for asking us, I would say, regulated companies, in our case, insurer, for our opinion about regulation. Actually, which is, I, by the way, welcome it with great enthusiasm, because I think this is all about dialogue. Now, as AXA, as a large insurer, right, we of course do care about regulation, but more than regulation, we do certainly care about our 110 million customers, right? And actually the customers are the ones who are going to be impacted if something goes wrong with artificial intelligence. So I think all this discussion is about people at the end and not about technology. So let me take your two questions. I will take the first one, which is, does AI needs to be regulatory? Does AI needs regulatory action, right? And I have to say, I've been 25 years working on artificial intelligence, and it's amazing what we're able to do today, right? We're able to predict skin cancer. We're able to unfold proteins, which we're not able to do this before. We're able to beat the grandmasters in Go. So this is really great. But AI is very different in nature, I would say. And I wanted to focus on 2 points for understanding, right? The first one is that this is not explicitly programmed, right? Is it not about if-then rules, right? And if it was with simple rules, then this wouldn't be AI, right? Because it would be, we are just explicitly programming, right? And the second aspect I would like to talk about is about the fact that today we're reaching performance which is human-like and sometimes even superhuman, and this superhumanity or this humanity aspect can be quite deceiving, right? So actually, this AI brings to us, all of us, and actually in particular to our customers in some new challenges, right? So if you put, and this is what we do, right? If we put in production some AI, for example, to predict a score, for example, for cancer, that I said, but it can be a score for something else, right? And you think about the fact that this is not explicitly programmed, then you will not be able to explain the decisions of the AI precisely, how the decision was made done. So I want to be very clear, because we have a lot of people here, is that we do understand how the machine learning and how the artificial intelligence work, but the complexity of how the result is deducted or how it's achieved is ungraspable. It's very difficult to grasp and to explain without oversimplifying, right? And another example I wanted to bring is if you put in production something, a different type of AI, for example, this time you put something like a voice bot, okay, or a chat bot. Maybe a voice bot is better. And its performance, it could be so good that the customer doesn't know that he's interacting with the bot, and this can be deceiving. And we can even think even further and realize that even worse, something like he can fall in love, for example, with the bot. I mean, this can be really deceiving. So when I say all this, I think this all leads to a kind of obvious conclusion. I think this conclusion is we should regulate AI. Now, when you say obvious doesn't mean this is feasible. It's not because you write it on a piece of paper you can really do it. And obvious doesn't mean necessarily that this is the right way to do it. I mean, maybe this is not about regulating AI, but this is about regulating something else. In fact, if you think about the AI, is quite elusive as a concept in itself, right? It can be very different in nature. I tell you about this course. I told you also about the voice bots. And these are very different. And so how do you want to regulate something that is very difficult to define and even to grasp? And if you think about our financial sector, right? What is the difference between a complex regression or let's say a fancy regression with something called today deep learning? These at the end are quite similar. So in the both examples, what we do care is actually the impact of this technology or whatever we're using to the human beings. So this leads me to my conclusion, which is AI is a great opportunity for progress, and this is clear. But when we are implementing this at scale, this implementation reveals some very old and also some new challenges, and which can eventually affect our customers. And so I think that it's not about regulating AI, actually not regulating the technology per se. It's about making sure nothing goes wrong, regardless of the technology. And people are talking about techno neutrality, for example. But I think the very important aspect is when we're thinking about regulation, is we need to think about the AI because AI is different, the AI is new. And this we have to keep in mind. So this is what I wanted to bring before jumping into the different types, but maybe I would like to listen to our other friends, our other panelists about the different types or what's their opinion.
Thank you, Marcin. That's great. Nicolas, you come from an AI company, so I'm really interested to hear your response to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to the broad question of whether AI in financial services should be regulated or not, there is no question that financial services being what they are, some level of regulation is necessary. The challenge, of course, is that AI as a field has been evolving tremendously rapidly. And there is, of course, the danger that when a regulation is put in place, it becomes outdated by the time it becomes enforceable. And for this reason, it is understandable that regulators have been broadly cautious about over-regulating or about premature regulation that could be too broad or that could hamper progress in some shape or form, and at the end of the day, could do more harm than good. So there has been more of a movement towards regulatory guidance, and I think a great example of that have been the fairness, ethics, transparency, and accountability, or the so-called FEED principles that MAS introduced at this festival about 2 years ago. And those principles have started to be instantiated, for example, through a consortium called the Veritas Consortium that is tasked with translating those broad principles into tangible action and behavior in the context of specific use cases in the financial industry. So it's easy to see that this progressive effort could, as we gain experience, turn into binding regulation. There is certainly some updating of laws that is necessary. So if we think about fairness, for example, we might think, okay, well, we want to not discriminate against certain protected groups, for example, not discriminate against gender or ethnic identity. And we know from research that ignoring those attributes when making a decision does not work, does not make a model fair. This so-called fairness through unawareness is not a principle that will give us fairness in the first place. So there is still an intricate interplay between research and regulatory consequences about social outcomes. And one of the parallels I like to think about is really in the way that accounting standards, for example, have evolved over several decades of experience in the early 20th century. We really, in the accounting profession, rely on three different pillars. Yes, there is the regulatory pillar, but firms have to set up a whole set of internal controls and governance standards and tools to make sure that they abide by these principles. And the third pillar, so that's the second pillar, and the third one is really having trained professionals that need to go through gruesome professional qualifications in order to gain the judgment to make decisions in cases where there is a gray zone. And if they don't do that, they fail by their professional obligations, might be barred from practicing in extreme cases. And I totally see AI evolving towards relying on three pillars of this sort. So regulatory internal controls and trained professionals that will be practitioners in implementing those standards.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. Amy, I think you're next up. You no doubt have a good perspective from HSBC, given the involvement in the Veritas Consortium work that Nicolas just mentioned. So I'm really interested to hear from you on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And it's great to be here. So I think it's a really critical question, as AI is the driving force for many of the industry transformation. But if we look at the financial services, we still, the use of AI is still very limited because we are heavily, regulated, and we are still using reasonably traditional, methods in terms of credit scoring, for example, or some of the fraud. And if we are able to use more advanced methods and use the data, really leverage those data, I think we can reduce the risk and we can, improve the accuracy. I think that would be a good outcome for everyone. So in the sense, it's really important when we're thinking about this, we need to balance the innovation and the opportunity AI can bring to the financial services industry, but at the same time having a strong governance to prevent some of these emerging risks is actually in public, in everyone's interest, to build the customer trust and to ensure the decisions are ethical and non-biased. So essentially everyone is in the interest to adopt that responsible AI. And in terms of the spectrums, so I feel like there are so many, principles and guidance and consultation papers that have been published globally, and these are mostly principle-based. They are risk-based, or they focus on the outcome. So I think that's really useful to set up those level of guidance. And at the same time, if we're starting to work out how to implement some of these principles, as Nicolas mentioned, the fee principle and some of the implementation efforts has been going on with the Veritas Consortium. So I can see that as a really practical and this is an open dialogue and a co-development between the regulators and the industry and the academics and consumer, in the sense to work it out. So I feel like it's in the industry's interest to show we can take this responsibly, and we have the good governance, and we are motivated, to show evidence and then making sure those decisions are good and fair, and they resilient, when things are changing. So I think those are the a good practice, and we should continue, to develop. We're still quite early in that journey. The other points I think worth mentioning is about the harmony of different regions and the international. So there is no one size fit all. There's always, specific, customized and the local specifics, but a common approach and a common kind of a framework would be really useful in here, especially for global companies to implement them.
That's really fascinating, Amy. Thank you very much. John, being from the academic side of things, you must have a fascinating insight into these discussions. Why don't you give us your perspective?
Well, thank you, Nick. I think we're all agreed that some level of regulation is necessary. So the key issue is, what form should that regulation take? Should it be laws from on high, or should it be guidance and self-regulation? I think, and it's not one or the other. I think there are some areas where there's clearly scope for laws, such as the European Union's GDPR, which cover things like a person's ownership of their own data. If you give an organization data for one purpose, they can't use it for another purpose. If there's a data breach, then people have the right to know about it immediately. And then things such as those issues concerned with discrimination, which Nicolas touched on. Those are clearly things where laws are appropriate, but there's other areas where guidance can handle things, I think. I've done a lot of work in the derivatives and risk management area, and in 2011, the Fed published a supervisory letter on model risk management. It's now almost 10 years old, but it seems to have stood the test of time. So it's about how banks should handle models within their organization. And of course, most of the things we're talking about are models of one sort or another. So what's the sort of things it says? It says there should be an independent review of a model within an organization. We should check every year to ensure that the model is still appropriate. We should get input from model users, those sort of things. And, they're all general guidance that is applicable, I think, to the sort of models that we're talking about, albeit much more complex models than the ones we've been used to. Maybe I could pick up on a couple of points which the previous speakers have mentioned. I mean, Nicolas mentioned, the accounting profession and the professional designations that one has to have within the accounting profession. And the same would be true within the actuarial profession, but we have some qualifications that people can get within derivatives and risk management, but they haven't become mandatory, and I don't see any real sign that they will become mandatory. So it's kind of interesting, this whole process of how a profession moves towards a particular designation being mandatory. I don't see that happening within machine learning and AI. And Amy brought up the subject of international regulations or international guidance, and I think that's very important. It's too easy for data to go across country borders and so on. So it would be nice if different countries in the world could get together to produce international guidance as far as all of this is concerned.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. So if I was to summarize the viewpoints from the panel on this topic, there definitely is a need for regulators to take action. But that action should be a range of different approaches. There should be some co-development between the regulators, the industry, and civil society on what those things should be. It should be proportionate to the risk and not disproportionate. It should be in some way technology neutral and not too specific to the particular technologies that may be used in artificial intelligence algorithms or something. there should be some alignment to international norms. And really, ideally, it would build on existing frameworks, such as the couple of frameworks that were mentioned there. So now I want to turn to the deployers of AI. And since it's pretty obvious that the deployers of AI shouldn't wait for the regulators to undertake these actions, in fact, they should probably step into this matter of responsible AI. What are the key elements that you think regulated institutions and fintech vendors who are deployers of AI should consider to build an effective internal set of controls for responsible and ethical AI, and also to externally build trust with customers, consumer advocates, and civil society about their use of AI? And Amy, I might start with you on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think we certainly want to stay ahead of the curve, and the ethical use of AI is very important an agenda in HSBC. So we embarked on the journey starting from early 2019. There's maybe I'll share a few points around how we think about the implementation. So from the driving the principle perspective, that is really starting from the top of the house. So the sponsorship is really important. So in HSBC, we established a AI executive committee, which will oversee our principle, set up the top line, and the set of principles, which is 7 principles, has been published in February. Since then, there's the head of the businesses, they are accountable for setting up the practices, and there are awareness sections, executive awareness training or developers training all being developed. So I think that's the first thing, is from the sponsorship and setting up the principle perspective, really starting from the top is critical in this topic. The second point is about the implementation, because that's from the business policy and governance and structure point of view, we leverage a lot of the existing framework and adding what is the AI or ML kind of a specific component to enhance our overall that structure. So there was a couple of people also mentioned this, if we leverage on the model risk management framework, for example, which is very well established, and the certain components we need to add more. For instance, on the data side, we need to understand more of where the data coming from, what's the real quality, and how does that is it a balanced and well representative of our population, and plus our user case. So these are the additional information we really need to get a good understanding, because the AML models use much more sources of data and the features. So the second part is about explainability, for example, for the model. So we do want to understand a lot more. We can explain them, but sometimes if you can't explain it, but at least we need to understand some of the behavior, and trying to use the model card concept, for example, just to give much more detailed description, the documentation, and where it should be applied, how you can test it. For somebody else, if they want to use this kind of a model, they got a better understanding of what that is. And then Nick, we've been working on some of the methods as well with your team. I think these are all the innovation, really enabling us to get a deeper understanding in that, and a lot more, research into this area. I think is really exciting. I think probably the last one is around continuous monitoring of the output. So the output sometimes, well, this is an iterative approach, and you need to look at the fairness bias, or from the outcome perspective, and keep on learning if there's something it doesn't look quite right. And I think that iterative approach is the other thing we need to introduce, and quite often these are starting to be embedded into the machine learning pipeline, for example, as the end-to-end management. So the last point I would say, we're also very actively engaged with the external collaboration and the ecosystem, and this is part of our principle actually to contribute to the development, but also we learned a lot from working with the regulators, and MAS being one of the examples, and Bank of England and FCA in the UK, or a spectrum of research companies as well. So the ecosystem, I think, we need to solve this responsible AI not from a single company or a single sector perspective. It's really getting the ecosystem and continue that test and learn approach.
Thank you, Amy. John, you mentioned SR 11.7 as a great baseline of internal controls, and SR 11.7 came out in 2011, I think, if I remember correctly, and is kind of the Bible of management of statistical risk in financial services. What's your thoughts about these additional elements that regulated institutions and fintech vendors might need to consider to build on those existing practices to address the additional risks and ethical challenges that are raised by use of AI?
Yeah, I think they have a big incentive to do what you're talking about. I mean, the last thing that companies want is regulators coming down and saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. It's much better to self-regulate. So I think there's a big incentive to self-regulate. In terms of the additional things we need, in addition to the very general stuff that's in SR 11.7, for example, I mean, there's good practice in machine learning, for example, having a training set, a validation set, and a test set to make sure you don't overfit the data and that sort of thing. I think that's, there's some sort of general guidelines and standards associated with that. Also, I mean, we're dealing with models which are a lot more complex than traditionally the models that we've dealt with. And so I think model interpretability is really important. It's really important to devote resources to model interpretability rather than just going out and developing more and more complex models. I mean, for example, if a customer comes into a bank and is told they've been rejected for a loan, and they're say, well, why have I been rejected for this loan? And the answer is, well, the algorithm said you've been rejected. I mean, that's not going to be a very satisfactory response. So we've got to have ways of making models or the output of models meaningful to customers, which, at the end of the day, as Marcin said, it's all about customers. And it's also, but we don't want our employees to be second-guessing models all the time. We want them, we want them to be regarding models as a tool which they can use. And for them to be able to regard models as a tool they can use, they've got to understand the model. So this will be my main point, I think, that in addition to the sort of very general stuff that we have that is good guidance on models, I think we have to devote resources to model interpretability.
Thank you. Marcin, I'm really interested in your response to this, given that you come from AXA and the insurance industry has a very long heritage of managing actuarial risk. So I'm interested to hear from your perspective, what are the additional control elements that you would recommend that financial services companies and fintechs look into implementing?
Yeah, so I would say in your question, there are two aspects. There's the internal one and the external one. Let me try to be quick. I mean, because time is flying and we're a lot of people. But so on the internal side, I think, again, this is not, this time I say this is not just purely about technology, right? I think, as I tried to say in the first round, and I think I heard also this from Nicolas, is that technology is difficult to grasp. So it's a lot about process and governance. And I think this is also what was said previously in this round of questions, right? And this governance need to have some sort of impact on the ground. This is where the technology kicks in. And I think there are two dimensions, and it was mentioned by Amy. I think this is going from having some sort of accountability in the board down to the person who is managing the model, right? And looking that there is no overfit or something. So there is this verticality in the company that needs to be addressed in the governance, right? And then there is this more horizontal aspect of it, which is the nature of AI, right? I mentioned, somebody mentioned credit scoring, well, and you have also voice bots in production, and you have all sort of things. And I think this very transversal aspect, it's challenging in terms of governance because you need to make people talking from different departments. And my advice would be, in terms of governance, this is what we're trying to do, is trying to use already what is existing there. And I think Amy at HSBC is doing the same thing. It's trying to leverage what is already existing, having this time in mind AI, right? So which is a little bit different. Now, very quickly on the external part, about building trust with our customers. I think we wrote a paper. We have a research team, and we wrote a paper on this, and it's a very large topic because AI, in some sense, is a technology. So you need to trust the technology in some sense. It's an organization. Usually, your AI, if you think of a bot, it's representing you, and also has a human aspect because it turns to have human-like performances, right? And so, in a nutshell, really, really quickly, I mean, this is about credibility. So credibility of you. It's about also reliability. I mean, if you have somebody who is not reliable, you don't trust him, right? So it's the same thing. So it's very important, good performance, reliability. Also, it's important your purpose, and that's kind of on the culture of your company and your values. And last point, really quickly, I think very, very negative, and I think this is also happens to human beings, is about authenticity, right? So, and what is authenticity here? How we can translate it is about not talking about ethics and saying, oh, we're going to be ethical, is making this happen. And I think this was said by the previous speaker. This is the thing. Last advice, and this is because I lead the research team at AXA. I think we heard already, this is all the time developing topic. And I think we do need to invest either research internally or in the ecosystem, as was said before. Yeah, that's back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Nicolas, you obviously come from an AI company which has done a lot of work in these fields, particularly model complexity, interpretability, and those topics which have been mentioned. So I'm really interested to hear from you as to your advice for implementers as to how they can overcome some of these challenges that have been mentioned.
Oh,
you appear to be on mute.
Thanks. So a lot has been said by the other panelists so far. So very quickly, just to add to this, yesterday at this FinTech festival, there was the first Veritas report on fairness that was released, and a comprehensive report on the fairness assessment methodology will be released by MAS imminently. So I think the short answer to the question is actually to go take a look at this much more comprehensive document. And what we find in there is actually a methodology for a continuous improvement journey. So the main message is that tools are not enough. We need to surround them by the appropriate management framework. We need to seek continuous improvement around the use of those. Of course, explainability is one of the FEAT principles. Our own team has developed a number of methods for explainability. Those still tend to be quite model specific and context specific. We'll not get into the details, but different types of explainability methods are appropriate depending on who will be receiving the explanation and what is the goal that we seek out of the explanation. But this is still a very, very active field of research in machine learning with whole conferences that are now being dedicated to those questions.
Fantastic, thanks very much. So I might, we've mentioned a number of different resources. I might just go around the table very quickly and maybe mention one resource that you would advise people to go and look at, whether that's a website or a paper or a company's capabilities. Amy, would you like to start?
I think one of the papers is really good from the, it's called a Principled AI, which is mapping consensus in ethical and right-based approach, which is published in January 2020 by Bertrand Klein Center for Internet and Society. That mapped up the common framework. I think is well worth having a look if you haven't.
Marcin, would you like to go next?
Yes, I wanted to mention the Veritas report. It was already done. I think the other organizations are doing IOPA. I mean, it's about to publish, it's the European one. It's about to publish a report also in January. There is the French, for those who speak French, a very good report from the ACPR. There is also a very nice paper from ICO in trying to understand the impact, because I mean, this is quite related to data privacy. So ICO. So that's kind of for regulators. I think there is a big thing. And then I think it's a lot about discussion. So there are these venues, for example, and there's also the World Summit AI one. There's the FACCT. I think Nicolas had this one in mind, because this is where scientists try to bring up new solutions. So, and last, I think if you try to follow us on Twitter, on this, the people in this panel, we're very active, all of us in this. And if you follow us, we regularly post places and information about it. So, I mean, if you can say for all of us as a team, this is a good place to go to.
Well, that's great. Fantastic. We have run out of time. So I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for the fantastic discussion today. And thank you to the MAS and the Singapore FinTech Festival team for organising such a great event. Thank you, everyone, for listening in, and good day from our panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was absolutely a pleasure to see you all, Nick, on the Global Channel. What a thought-provoking discussion as well on artificial intelligence regulation. Just a reminder, that was a panel moderated by Nick Lewins from Microsoft. So the key takeaways: do you think the use of artificial intelligence in financial services should be regulated?